Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another session of a random walk down Mill Street. Tonight's session is sponsored by Rabbi Harris Guedalia and by my mother, Rose Guedalia Edinger, in memory of my grandparents, Judah and Selma Guedalia. Many of you, although not all, will remember them, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. Today, for another few moments, or at least up until this past day, was the anniversary of my grandfather, Zichrono Livracha, and next Wednesday will be the anniversary of my grandmother. She passed away before him, but her anniversary comes 1 week after his. And so this is this presentation is in honor of them. What we're going to talk about today is the Guedalia Family's association with Shearith Israel. It is many generations long, not quite as some of our historical families that go all the way back to colonial days, but I do think there is something kind of special about being associated with one synagogue for generation after generation after generation, and not just being members, but also being very involved and servants of the congregation for much of that time. And so I thought I would let you all know about that connection that I have going back to the 19th century and go through it. And I do apologize in advance that my PowerPoint presentation is not as polished as I was hoping it would be, but hopefully you'll forgive me for that. And so why don't we get started? Okay, this is just the main screen, but let's minimize this today. Okay. And feel free to use the chat for whenever you have questions or comments. I'm going to start with just a little bit of the background of the Guedalia family. The origins of the Guedalia family are so I'm going to talk about the prehistory a little bit. How do I make this smaller? Sorry if I'm getting this a little bit. There we go. Okay. Just making sure you can hear me properly. Is that correct? Yes? Okay. Very good. The origins of the Guedalia family are a little bit, there's a couple different families at possible origin. The oldest one is the family of Don Judah Guedalia, also known as Rabbi Judah Guedalia, Yehuda Guedalia, who was a printer born in Lisbon before the expulsion of Jews from Spain and before the conversion of the Jews in Portugal. He worked in the printing press of Eliezer Toledano, who was a famous Hebrew printer in that era. This is the first generation of printing. He left and escaped Lisbon and moved to Salonika. And he brought the printing press typeset with him. And he established, I believe, the first Hebrew printing press in Salonika, and was responsible for printing many famous works, including the Ein Yaakov of Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib. And this is a picture of it right here. So I don't know if I'm descended from him or not, but it's possible. Some other possibilities, and maybe these people are related to each other, it's also unclear, is a rabbi who was in Amsterdam and in Hamburg named Shemuel Guedalia. Here his epitaph is known from Hamburg and from other sources. And also there was an Israeli branch that was in Jerusalem and later in Tzfat, the family of Abraham Guedalia, who was also a bit of a printer and an editor and an author, and he wrote a commentary on the Yalkut Shimoni, which I'm showing you here in the middle here. He also traveled through Italy. Another possibility, and some of these families may be related to each other, it's a little unclear. We don't know all the branches of them. There is a Guedalia family from Mogador, from Morocco. Several brothers from the early 18th century that are talked about. And they have descendants today named Guedalia, spelt with two L's in the Spanish spelling, in London, in London, a fairly famous family that married into the Montefiore family. But I have no idea if I'm related to any of those people. But they are possible origins of our family. But now I'm going to move to what we do know. And what we do know is that the Guedalia family came from Livorno. And I just have a picture here of the synagogue in Livorno. I believe this is from Simchat Torah. And you can see a beautiful picture. This is a British painter named Hart, who has this very famous painting of the synagogue in Livorno. This is from the middle of the 19th century. My family, by the way, was no longer in Livorno when this painting would have been painted. And here's a picture of the synagogue, which existed from the late 18th century until World War II. It was destroyed in World War II, and a new synagogue has been built that is very modern. And if you go to Livorno today, you will no longer see this grand old synagogue. You'll see a large new synagogue in its place. So my ancestors came from Livorno to Gibraltar in the very beginning of the 19th century. This fellow here, Aaron, or sometimes known as Moses Aaron, Guedalia, married a woman named Bathsheba. We don't know much about her, and had a son named Yaakov. Again, I don't know if they had other children or not. I'm not aware of them. This is they would have been the end of the 18th century in Livorno. At some point, they travel to Gibraltar and decide to stay there. Jacob was at the time, I believe, 6 years old when they moved to Gibraltar. And he grows up there and he marries Sarah Beniso. Beniso is another famous family in the Gibraltarian Jewry. And in fact, one of the descendants of Moses and Esther, Beniso, was a Chazan in London, among other famous descendants as well. But so if you know the name Beniso, they are distantly related to my family. We're going to talk tonight about this descendants of these three brothers. You see, there were a lot of children. Not all of them survived into adulthood, but many of them did. But these three brothers, Moses, Judah, and Aaron, all came to the United States and were associated with our congregation in Shearith Israel. Some of the daughters also did. I think Yael married someone named Abraham Ben Naim, who was also a member of Shearith Israel. And the other ones either stayed in Gibraltar or married and moved to London. And I don't know much about their branches. This is the picture, by the way, of one in Gibraltar. There are 4 or 5 synagogues. One of them is called the Flemish synagogue, and this is that synagogue. It's a pretty large community today, and it has been for quite a while. And there are 2 parts of that community. One which is what we would call Western Sephardic, Spanish Portuguese, the other which is more Moroccan. And that actually explains why they have a synagogue called the Flemish synagogue, which was following more closely to the Dutch, Spanish Portuguese, Western Sephardic traditions. And some of the other ones are more closely related to the Moroccan traditions. And if you go there today, it kind of seamlessly jumps together. But there are these differences in this very, relatively small community. And they have, I think, 4 or 5 synagogues, and there is a rota where different synagogues are used for important occasions. There's always minyan in each of them, but for holidays or special occasions, they'll use different synagogues on a rotation so that they each get honored. So we're going to talk tonight about Moses, Judah, and Aaron. I am descended from this fellow named Judah. And here we have some items related to him. His name was also Leon. In fact, Judah was his Hebrew name, Yehudah. Secularly, he used the name Leon. And we have some, in my family, we have some books of his. I just gave you the cover of one of them. I tried to figure out what year he was writing here, and I'm not sure. I couldn't figure it out. I'll need to work on that a little more. But this is when before he was married. He was married in 1864. I don't know the year that he moved to the United States, but it's before 1864. So he was only 24 years old when he was in the United States. And he is the first of those 3 brothers to move to the United States. He was married or with Shearith Israel. He was married actually at an address on Grand Street, but by our minister, Jacques Judah Lyons. His wife's name was Pauline Marks. And here is his ketubah, which is in Shearith Israel's record books. Now, he was an able reader of services. He had no function officially at the synagogue, But if you look through the lists of the time, you will see that he read Haftarot and other things. I particularly like this message here, which is from the diary of Jacques Judah Lyons from 1877, which is the last year of Reverend Lyons' life. And I'm not sure you can read it so clearly, but he tells you, this is the third page of several entries where he talks about how he had some kind of heart attack. He doesn't call it a heart attack, but he had an illness of his affecting his heart and pain in his heart, and he was unable to go to services, and he was unable to fast. But nevertheless he reports on all the details that he was told about, including the weather. So it says Shachrit Tisha B'Av, and it says weather. I don't know if you can read it up here. It says weather clear and showery at times. Attendance very good. Chazan absent from sickness which prevented him from fasting. That's he's talking about himself. Service by Reverend H. Pereira Mendes, who had just come a few months earlier. And then he tells you exactly who read, including Asher Kersheet, Mr. Phillips, J. Edgar Phillips, Louis Hyman, Julius Lyons, that's his own son, Moritz Cohen, and El Guedalia assisted with the keynotes. So I know that already back in the 19th century, my ancestors were involved in the synagogue, reading services, reading keynotes. Which is a particular point of interest to me, because there are certain keynotes which my grandfather told me we had a chazaka on, and perhaps they goes really far back. Who knows? I have another entry from a few years earlier, less flattering, but kind of interesting. This is an entry from the diary of Jacques Judah Lyons found in the archives of Shearith Israel. And if you read it, it says June 2nd, 5634 is 1874. Received a letter from Mr. Abacassis, that is the Parnas of the congregation, telling him that he was going to be away, and in his absence, that whoever is serving as Parnas should not, I don't know if you can read this, not to give any mitzvah to El Guedalia, as he has insulted, been disrespectful to him. I don't know what it was. I don't know what he did that was disrespectful to the Parnas, but Mr. Abacassis was not amused and did not want any mitzvah or honor going to El Guedalia. And I like how, and so Lyons reproduces this in his diary, but then he has this little quote at the bottom, which I think is really quite excellent. And this is Lyons' own comment on this instruction. He wrote, artillery on a fly, which basically means much ado about nothing. He doesn't like that that Parnas Abacassis is preventing my ancestor from reading services because of some perceived plight, and he thinks that it's blowing up something insignificant. Anyway, that's my great grandfather Leon Guedalia, otherwise known as Judah Leon Guedalia. Now he had a brother named Moses. This is a picture that I have. On the back of the picture of my family, it says Moses Guedalia. I'm not 100% sure that this is Moses. It might be his brother Aaron, but on the back it says Moses, so we'll go with that. He was a learned person. He was born in 1839. He was the oldest of those three brothers. And before coming to the United States, he actually worked, he went to Brazil, and he was trading in tobacco. The family business, his brother Aaron was a manufacturer of cigars, and he was working with him. And one of our cousins actually sent me an old Haggadah of Pesach, as well as another sefer had many things in it about Pesach, all halachot of Pesach, and minhagim of Pesach, which Moses Guedalia found in the 1860s in the Amazon in Brazil on a trip to purchase tobacco in a village, in a villager's hut. And he writes on the front of the book, or in the front cover of the book, that he found it there, and he redeemed it for 2.5 pounds of tobacco. and brought it back with him. So I have this book. I was trying to get a picture of it for you. I'll have to wait. Well, that'll have to be one of the follow-ups, or maybe you can email me if you're interested about this book that he found in Brazil. And when he comes to the United States, also marries here in the United States. And he is a bit of a chazan. And as you can see here in 1888, 1889, he, along with other Gibraltarian Jews, he was living in what we would call now Spanish Harlem, made a new synagogue. And this is an entry from the New York Times from 1889, where it talks about new synagogues that were consecrated. It's at the consecration of the new synagogue of Congregation Moses Montefiore at 160 East 112th Street. 160 East 112th Street. Was celebrated yesterday, September 22nd. Services were conducted by Reverend Moses Guedalia, the reader of the congregation. He was the shamash. It was a chazan, sorry. Assisted by Reverend Dr. Sabato Moraes of Philadelphia, pretty famous rabbi, and the Reverend Dr. H. Pereira Mendes, our own minister from Shearith Israel, and the Reverend Abraham Nieto of Shearith Israel. The dedication services of the consisted of the usual processional, bearing the scrolls of the law, lighting the perpetual lamp, and opening of the ark, and the return of the ark to and the Sepharim to the ark. The ceremonies were most impressive, as was the trained choir of little boys who sang and chanted beautiful psalms of David. And here is actually a picture from Shearith Israel archives of the choir of the Moses Montefiore congregation. Unfortunately, it is not dated and has no names. So I do not know any of these boys. I sometimes think that this young man here bears a Guedalia visage, but I don't know. No idea who these are. But there is a picture of the choir of the Moses Montefiore congregation. And this was the synagogue that our family went to, as they lived too far away from 19th Street to go to Shearith Israel regularly, and they started their own synagogue called the Moses Montefiore congregation. Now, it was associated with Shearith Israel, and as you can see, Shearith Israel ministers were connected to it and came to its opening. And let's just see here. This is from Dr. Poole's book. The congregation was given material aid by Shearith Israel when it came into being, and from time to time later. It met for 2 decades until its members scattered to other parts of the city, and its story came to an end. So by the beginning, by 1909, 1910, this congregation ceased to exist anymore. But for about 20 years, there was a Gibraltarian Spanish-Portuguese minyan synagogue in Spanish Harlem, run by Moses Guedalia. Now, when the synagogue, this was not his only service as a chazan, as you shall see. Earlier in 1899, before the end of it, while the Shearith Israel put forward Moses Guedalia as the chazan for the new congregation in Newport. Congregation in Newport was run by the Rabbi Abraham Pereira Mendes until his death in 1884, 1885. And then, or 1888 maybe, I forget the year. Then there was another minister who came from Holland, whose name was David Baruch. And when he died, the congregation elected Moses Guedalia to be the chazan. Unfortunately, right at this time, right in 1899, 1900, the Turo congregation split in Newport, and an Ashkenazi congregation tried to take over, and there was a big fight, the ramifications of which still exist today. But what that means is that Moses Guedalia never actually officiated, or barely had any time to officiate in the Torah synagogue before the Ashkenazic contingent demanded an Ashkenazic chazan, which is what ultimately happened. They fought about it for a little while, but ultimately that's what ended up happening there, and still to this day. There was another thing that Moses Guedalia started, and that was a chebra. So in Shearith Israel, there is something called the Chebra Chassid Ba'amet, which takes care of the burial and funeral rites of its members, but is not connected to non-members, and it's only rare occasions that non-members would be involved. And being that there was this Moses Montefiore congregation all the way up in Harlem, they started their own Sephardic chebra called the Union and Peace Society. And this is a little entry about it from a newspaper in Rochester, New York in 1899. Who knows? The one thing I can tell you is that their grounds for burial are in a cemetery called Mount Nebo, which is very close to our cemetery in Queens. And that's where Moses and his family are buried. Now we get to Shearith Israel. So after the Moses Montefiore congregation ceased to exist, Shearith Israel determined in 1908 to have overflow services. We call them overflow services. Then they called it the Free Synagogue. And here is actually an article about it. This is before the high holidays. Temple Shearith Israel has converted the assembly room of its handsome building on 70th Street, that's what we now call the Levy Auditorium, into a free synagogue for the holidays. The services will be conducted by the Reverend Moses Guedalia, and the English sermon will be delivered by Dr. David DeSolopoul, assistant minister of the congregation. So if you're familiar with the congregation today, you know that the overflow services are not really much of an overflow anymore. But at one point, the synagogue was packed to capacity, and people were not able to attend. And so they created extra services downstairs, which were run by members of my family the very first instance in 1908 by Moses Guedalia. And then in 1909, or at the end of 1908, a yearbook was produced by Shearith Israel. I wish we still did these today. They're really kind of interesting, where the president and the Chazan, who at that time was Henry Pereira Mendes, and the president was N. Taylor Phillips, Louis L. Napoleon Levy, wrote about the year that passed. And there's a little report on what happened. And says, during the recent Kippur holiday, we initiated a successful innovation by using the large assembly room for overflow services for those strangers whom we have not been able to accommodate. They were conducted by Mr. M. Guedalia, assisted by his sons, whose sons were Hiram Guedalia and Jacob Guedalia, and with Mr. Malamed, who is a person we'll talk about another day, with gratifying results that I recommend their continuation from year to year. So this was the very first time it happened. It worked out well, and those services continue to this very day. The overflow downstairs on the high holidays. Moses Guedalia continued to then year after year after year, and here's just a report from 1914. He died in 1915. Here's a report from 1914. The trustees of Shearith Israel forwarded a resolution of thanks to Mr. Moses Guedalia, acknowledgement of his services during the recent holy days in connection with the Free Synagogue. This is a newspaper report. It's amazing that people would even put such things in the newspaper. For the past 8 years, Mr. Guedalia has officiated all services, Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, and his efficient service is appreciated by a large congregation of worshipers. So after the Moses Montefiore congregation and after some of his other endeavors, Moses Guedalia served Shearith Israel in running the overflow services in his synagogue. I was going to write more about Aaron Guedalia, but I ran out of time. But Aaron Guedalia is the third of those three brothers who came from Gibraltar to the United States. He was married in the late 1860s by Jacques Judah Lyons as well. All three brothers were married in New York to Ashkenazic women and by Jacques Judah Lyons. Aaron Guedalia was not a minister and did not, as far as I know, read services like his two older brothers did. But he was in business, and his main business was cigars. In fact, his company, Guedalia and Co., they imported and rolled Cuban cigars with tobacco from Cuba. And here, here's a little picture of him after he died. His son, whose name was Nathan, continued the business and made a brand in memory of his father with a picture of his father on the cigar band. And there it is, La Flor de Guedalia, with a picture of Aaron Guedalia right there on the cigar band. Here's another picture of him, by the way. This is from a visit that he went to Gibraltar and met with his cousin. This is a staged photo in a studio, but not a very good one. I've been trying to find the original, but this is Aaron Guedalia. Now, Aaron Guedalia's wife was very involved in the sisterhood, and I was hoping to put some pictures there of that, but we'll have to save that for another talk about the sisterhood, perhaps. Okay. Now, Moses Guedalia, as we mentioned earlier, had two sons who assisted him. One of them was Hiram Guedalia. This is a picture of Hiram Guedalia. Hiram Guedalia became Shamash of Shearith Israel in 1919 and served until his death in 1928. He died on Sukkot during services, I believe. I mean, I don't know if he died during services, but he died while he was Shamash on Sukkot in 1928. Before he had been Shamash, he had been in real estate and other businesses. And if you Google enough, you'll find things. Here he was running something called the Guedalia Cottage. And the advertisement, which is from a Jewish newspaper, says that services are unsurpassed, Jewish dietary laws strictly observed, Hiram Guedalia proprietor. But then after 1919, I don't think he ran this cottage anymore, and he became the full-time Shamash of Shearith Israel. He died in 1928, and his son, Moses Guedalia, who's the grandson of the Moses Guedalia we heard before, took over for him. And Moses Guedalia grew up in the synagogue as well. He was bar mitzvah here at Shearith Israel, and he was involved in the league and young men's league and all sorts of activities in the synagogue. And when his father passed away, he took over as Shamash and served for another 10 years. Now, I don't have any pictures of Moses Guedalia, of Mo Guedalia, but I can tell you a few stories about him. These are just some newspaper reports that I found. Not all that interesting, perhaps, but Moses Guedalia was he broke his arm. One of the minutes notes, he broke his arm in service to the synagogue, and I think that left a bad taste with him with the way he was treated by the board. I think he thought that there would be some extra compensation or something like that, and as a result, that was towards the end of his tenure. And in 1940, when he was up for renegotiating his contract, he asked for a higher salary, and the synagogue did not accommodate. And he decided that he would try to get another job, and he told the synagogue that he was going to resign and become the Shamash at the Jewish Center on 86th Street. That didn't happen, but his resignation was accepted, and he ended up not being the Shamash anymore. I don't know if that was his original plan or if it was just negotiating, but in any case, that's how he ended his tenure. And he went on to enter business and had a relatively successful career in business until his passing in 1963. And I am in touch with some of his descendants who live in South Carolina, North Carolina, but not very close these days. One little note is when I first started here at Shamash in 2011, 2012, I was in daily services in the small synagogue, and a gentleman came in who I'd never met before, and I was fresh. I was brand new as the Shamash, and I introduced myself. He was there for a nachala. He wanted to have Ashkabah read, and his name was I can't remember his name. It'll come to me after the class, of course. But he came up to me, and I said to him, I introduced myself. I'm Zachary Edinger. I'm the Shamash. He said, "Oh, nice to meet you." I said, "You might remember my grandfather, whose name was Guedalia." And to this day, he's the only person who ever said to me, "Mo or Judah." So he had memories of my grandfather's cousin, Mo Guedalia, who was Shamash until 1940. No one has ever asked me that question before or since, and I kind of missed that connection to the congregation. And anyway, in September of 1940, my grandfather became Shamash of Shearith Israel. Before we talk about my grandfather, so we talked about the overflow services a little bit. So my grandfather was born in the Bronx, and his father's name was Jacob Guedalia. And in addition to Moses Guedalia, who was an uncle of Jacob, running those overflow services were also conducted by my great grandfather Jacob, who I was trying to get a picture. I have pictures, but I didn't get in time. So that's Len. I'm sorry about that. But he ran services, the overflow services, and our family went to those overflow services during the high holidays when they were not in the main synagogue. And here I have, I just show you a picture. We have his prayer books with all sorts of notes in them about who to call to the Torah and the times of services. If you want to know the times of services, what time Ne'ilah ended from the 30s and the 40s, I can just pull out his prayer books, and they're all there. But also this interesting note that Dr. Poole wrote to him about a certain Mr. Farrow who was going to read Shachrit and Mincha and Kippur and knows the service, except for a few places. And here's where the note explains where he needs a little help. So that was my great-grandfather. And my grandfather was born into this congregation. That's, I guess, the point of what I'm trying to say. In many, not just from his own father, but his cousins, a lot of Guedalia families related to Shearith Israel as servants, as worshipers as well. And so now we come to my grandfather, whose name was Judah Guedalia, who, just to show you, he was bar mitzvah here in the synagogue, he was married in the synagogue, and then in 1940, he became an employee of the synagogue. So when you can't get enough of this place, that is the rule of the day for my family. Here's a picture from him. This is from the 40s for sure. Very young in this picture as Shamash. Here's another picture from the 1970s from a special service where they were taking out all the Sifrei Torah. My grandfather had a background in music. He was a pianist, and he actually had his own orchestra called Toby Woods and his orchestra, which he used to make extra money during the Depression. He was born in the Bronx. He went to James Monroe High School. And after high school, he also took classes at Baruch College to become an accountant. And he worked for the Workmen's Circle as an accountant. And then when his cousin, Moses, left the synagogue as Shamash, Dr. Poole went to him and asked him to become Shamash. And my grandmother, Selma, encouraged him to do it. My grandfather told me he initially didn't want to do it, that he didn't think it was a good job, but it was a stable job, which was important for a young married man with a young baby. And so he took the job with the encouragement of my grandmother, and became Shamash for 40 years. And he, as a result of his abilities, meaning his background in music as well as in accounting, he took on extra roles that his predecessors had not. He became the bookkeeper of the synagogue during his tenure as Shamash, something his predecessors had not done. One thing about Moses Guedalia, which I forgot to mention, is that it was under his tenure during the 30s when, before that, the Shamash was the sexton, meaning he was also the superintendent of the building. He was responsible for, the boiler and if anything broke, and maintenance of the building. During Moses Guedalia's tenure in the 1930s, they hired a building superintendent, and the Shamash's role was more ritual and record keeping of the synagogue and making sure that services ran smoothly, and less about maintaining the building itself. Okay. So just to show you a little bit of the accoutrements that the Shamash used to use, is from my grandfather's day. He had a little book that had all the rolls in it and slips of paper that could be taken in and out to say who was going to do what job on what week. And he was always working 2-3 weeks in advance, so he had all these weeks all lined up. Today, I do things on Wednesday and Thursday for Shabbat, except for the holidays, and I try to get a lot further out. In 1940, he took notes. He spoke with his cousin as well as with Dr. Poole about the job. And luckily, I have this notebook here, which I'm just showing you the front page of, just full of all sorts of information. Some of it is just interesting to me as Shamash, some of it just interesting historically. So I'm showing you this page because this is about Hanukkah, because it says something quite interesting. So they had to put tapers for the Chanukiah instead of flax. So what they used to do before my grandfather's time was they would take the flax from the etrogim. They don't even use that anymore. When you buy an etrog, it comes in a styrofoam container, but it used to be wrapped up in flax. I'm sure you remember, many of you might remember. And they used to use that flax to make a wick to use for the Chanukiah. And here he's writing a note instead of that, he's going to use tapers. But originally they used the flax to make it. Just I thought an interesting note. Lots of little things like that. Another one is by Rosh Hashanah where it says, if there's a Kohen, as there once used to be, put water in the laver. So there were times when the synagogue had very few Kohanim or no Kohanim, and had to be reminded in the notes whether to put water in the laver or not for the holidays. Here are just some more pictures. By the way, this is my mother and my father on their wedding day, 1967, and my grandfather. So just to show you some pictures of him. But I think we're going to listen to him a little bit because he was a chazan also, in addition to his duties as shamash. They added to his duties reading of services. And so he read services 3 times a week, sometimes 4 times a week, to relieve Dr. Gerstein and Dr. Poole of some of the duties. He also read services on Shabbat from time to time, whenever needed, especially in the summers. After 40 years of service, he retired, and Arnie Goldfarb became the shamash. But he was honored several times along the way. And I have a recording of him speaking. It's about 5 minutes long. If you bear with me for a little bit, we can listen to him speaking. This is from a dinner that was honoring A.P. Zemendes, as well as J.V. Fedank, becoming honorary trustees, as well as the Chatanim, Joe Abraham and Salim Inni. And at that special event, they also honored my grandfather, and this is his speech. I just want to make sure that we are able to listen to it properly. Here we go.
Panas, first I should like to thank you for this very beautiful gift.
Oops, did it stop? Why did it stop?
Thank you for reminding me of my 35th wedding anniversary. You must have a prophetic vision, because you've touched upon everything that I'm about to say and everything that I hold very dear to me. Again, I am most grateful to you and to the Board of Trustees for remembering me on this very special occasion. I'm also thankful to my dear friends, Mr. Salim Inni and Mr. Joseph Abraham, for giving me this opportunity to join with them at this very special Simcha. I should like to also thank Mr. A.P. Zemendes and Mr. J.V. Fedank for the many ways that they were of assistance to me, who gave so devotedly of their services to Shearith Israel. My years, as the Panas said before, my years at Shearith Israel have been very pleasant ones, and I am indebted to many for their assistance. At this time, I should like to mention just a few who were particularly helpful. I was indeed most fortunate to have benefited from the advice and counsel of men like Captain N. Taylor Phillips, Mr. Henry S. Hendricks, Judge Edgar J. Nathan, Jr., and more recently, Mr. Ephraim Belina and our Panas, Mr. Edgar J. Nathan III. And from the spiritual guidance of our revered ministers. Because of the leadership, moral fiber, and religious integrity of men of their stature, our tradition has been meticulously maintained for well over 300 years. Shearith Israel has excelled in many ways, but I should like to stress at this time one particular facet of my association. As you know, Scripture bids us to glorify the name of the Lord. This idea is interpreted by the rabbis in several ways. One should purchase the most beautiful etrog and lulav. One should build the most attractive sukkah. One should, in other words, beautify and enhance our religious mitzvot. This concept is carried out so carefully on Shabbatot, when the synagogue is attractively decorated with flowers, and on Sukkot, when the sukkah is embellished with many representative and symbolic accoutrements. The synagogue services are chanted by achazanim in measured tones, giving effect to both the spirit and the solemnity of the occasion. The very prayer books that we use, with a poetic translation by Dr. Poole, have given fuller meaning and understanding to our services. This very celebration, the Chatanim celebration, is one at which we strive to add more meaning and spiritual significance to the rejoicing of the Lord. The rabbis, in explaining the importance of beautifying synagogue mitzvot, have pointed out that by setting these high standards of synagogue observance, others will be encouraged to glorify the name of the Almighty. Shearith Israel's religious services, by their very dignity and beauty, give spiritual uplift and comfort to all who come to pray. Our forebears have indeed presented us with a rich tradition that offers a challenge both to the present and to the future. During its long and historic past, Shearith Israel has, even during periods of stress and change, remained steadfast to its principles and customs. In closing, may I paraphrase a quotation from Dr. Poole's book. It is my humble prayer that we may, by our example, help to preserve and spread our superb ritual and tradition, and turn the heart of parents to children, and children to parents, and the hearts of them both to God. Thank you.
Now, I chose that quote because it's personally important to me, because it's what drives me. Exactly that quote, that the services should be beautiful, the services should be inspiring, we should maintain our traditions, and hopefully inspire the future generations. And I know that my grandfather was inspired by that very thing, and his parents and his grandparents and his uncles and his cousins, and trying to maintain the glory of our synagogue and our services. And I try to do the same thing. Almost done here. Just have to go through a little more. I want to go on and talk for hours, but I can't bother you that much. By the way, this is my grandmother, Selma. She was very, very involved in the synagogue, very involved in the sisterhood, and other organizations. Next to her here is Esther Oppenheim. I don't know how many of you remember Esther Oppenheim. Probably quite a few. More of you will remember Mona, her daughter. And this was Mona's mother, Esther. And this is Edgar J. Nathan, the third. Okay, I could go on. I could show many more pictures. In fact, I was trying to get more pictures before I came onto the class. So one or two more slides. My grandfather, in addition, I think I mentioned that he was also quite a bit of a chazan, and he read services quite frequently, especially the Zemirot. And so just much more briefly, I could have chosen a lot of different things to play for you, but here's one thing from the Shabbat morning Zemirot.
Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai imloch, le'olam v'nged, v'haya.
I'll just stop it there. That was his voice. That was his voice as a much older man teaching me the Zemirot. That came from a recording when he was teaching me to read the Zemirot. Here I am at 13 for my bar mitzvah. And look where I've come now. How far have I come? Not very far, in exactly the same place. Anyway, let's see some of the chats here. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about my Uncle Harris. So I don't know if you've been counting the generations, but my grandfather's grandfather and his brothers came to New York from Gibraltar and were members here at the synagogue. My grandfather's great uncle, Moses, started the overflow services in 1908. My grandfather's father's cousin, Hiram, became Shamash in 1919. My great-grandfather, as well as Hiram and others, led those free services for many, many years. And then Hiram's son, Mo, became Shamash from 1928, 1929 until 1940. And then my grandfather. And now, if you're keeping counting, this is now, so that's 1, 2, 3, this is the fourth generation. My Uncle Harris became a rabbi here, assistant minister, what was his title. And people don't realize that he was there for quite a while. So in 1963, my uncle was finishing up rabbinical school at Yeshiva University. And he wanted to pursue additional rabbinical studies in London, I think to get what we would call Yadin Yadin, or an additional rabbinical degree at Jews College in London. And so Shearith Israel sponsored that education and paid for him to go to London and further his rabbinical studies, because Shearith Israel thought that there should be more young Sephardic rabbis in America. And this was something that they had already talked about in 1961. They started looking for an assistant minister. By the way, 1961 was a time when there was Dr. Poole was still, he was much older. He was on the Teba, Dr. Gerstein and Bram Cardozo, and my grandfather was the Shamash. So the synagogue had plenty of employees. It was a heyday for the synagogue, lots of members doing weddings all the time. It was a very busy time in the synagogue. And if you go through the record books, you'll see on any given week, there'll be a wedding performed by Dr. Gerstein, a wedding performed by Reverend Cardozo. It's busy. And so the synagogue decided they needed an assistant rabbi, and they had trouble finding anyone. And so they sent my uncle to London to continue his studies. And at that very time, he assisted Chacham Gaon in London. And 2 years later, in 1965, the synagogue reached an agreement through much negotiation with the Spanish and Portuguese congregation in London to arrange for Chacham Gaon to come to New York and serve as the Chacham of Shearith Israel in New York for half the year. And this was worked out by contract with amounts of time and who was responsible for paying certain expenses and salaries during various times of the year with Chacham Gaon. And although it's not in those contracts, this was partially enabled by the fact that my uncle was in London. And so he was able to, while the Chacham was in New York, London had no shortage of rabbis. They had other ministers there, including Abraham Levy, as well as others. But when the Chacham was away, my uncle was part of that rotation of ministers who served the London community. He taught in the Hebrew school. He was they did a rota there, also like in Gibraltar, where they would have Bevis Marks and and Lauderdale Road and other synagogues where the Chazanim would circulate. And so my uncle was part of that circulating group of ministers, while the Chacham Gaon was spending half the time in New York. In 1965, thank you, Solomon. In 1965, the synagogue, Shearith Israel, asked him to come back and serve as an assistant minister here on the Teba in New York City, which he did until 1969. And he was part of the rotation. He read services on the weekdays, he read Torah, he read services on Shabbat, he gave sermons occasionally, he gave sermons in the overflow services. And as many of you might remember, and some of you have told me numerous times, he mainly worked with the youth. He taught in the school. He arranged for Shabbat afternoon youth services, where Shabbat Mincha would be read once a month by members of teenagers of the congregation, something which in the minutes of the congregation gets a lot of discussion because Pisa Mendes was against it, but everyone else was for it. And I know Charlie Gorgie and Richard Schultz and others used to lead services then. And so that was my uncle. And in 1970, he moved to Israel. That didn't end his association with the synagogue, however, because for the next 3 years, he would come back every summer after Shavuot until the high holidays, and he would serve as an assistant minister during that time, allowing some of the other staff to take summer vacations. And that lasted until 1973, when he became the rabbi in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And so that was my uncle, who was an assistant minister here at Shearith Israel for close to 10 years during the 1960s. And one other thing I should mention before I move on from him is that in 1980, he was back in Israel after having served in Massachusetts and in Los Angeles. He moved to Israel permanently, and he helped found a Spanish-Portuguese congregation in Jerusalem, together with, and he didn't do it alone, but Rabbi Martin Vandenberg, who had formerly been in London, was also in Israel, and they realized that there were enough Spanish-Portuguese Jews between Amsterdam, London, and New York, as well as elsewhere, in Jerusalem to start a service. And that synagogue is called Sharei Ratzon. It meets once a month and on holidays in the old city of Jerusalem, in the Istanbuli synagogue, one of the 4 Sephardic synagogues in the old city. And it still meets to this day. It's sometimes hard to get minyan to walk to the old city from, people don't live in the old city as much as they used to, or near it as they used to. But I get emails from them every week, and they sometimes have services in other homes during the time. So that synagogue was founded by my uncle, together with Martin Vandenberg. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop the share. My point in doing so is not just to aggrandize myself and my history, but I think there is something special that is not lost on me, that to be part of this chain of tradition going back to the 19th century. And sometimes I feel a little bit of pressure to maintain standards that are almost impossible to maintain. I can tell you, when I look in the records of the synagogue, birth, death, marriage, bar mitzvah records that were kept by my predecessors, who happened to be my ancestors, they did things much better than we do today. In fact, I had a request. Someone asked me about a bar mitzvah that took place here in the 1990s. And around the year 2000. And it was difficult to find any physical record that I could share with the person who was asking. It was from another synagogue, had to do with a marriage, wanted some information about someone. Whereas had that request been for someone who was a member here in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, could have gotten the record like that. So who knows? Things ebb and flow. But during the period of my grandfather and his predecessors, it was a well-oiled ship, and I hope to maintain those minhagim as well as the attention and care to our services. I'm going to stop the share right now, and I hope also that maybe I won't be the last generation. Who knows? Maybe I'll be the last generation in the Guedalia family, but maybe there'll be others. We'll see. I'll see. I'll have to wait and see as my kids grow up. Take care, everybody. I'm going to stop the share and let everyone. I'm going to end the